The Spyglass, A Story of Faith by Richard Paul Evans. Once there was a great kingdom. The kingdom was known throughout all lands for its splendor, its magnificent buildings, its great terraced gardens, and bountiful farms. But through time, all that had changed. Now the once great buildings were falling down and in need of much repair. The farms were now small and did not grow enough food for the kingdom. The poor villagers would oftentimes go to bed hungry. The people of this kingdom were not just poor by way of things, but they were poor of spirit, for there was not much joy in the village. There were no dances around the maypole nor palace cotillions. Rarely was music heard, but for the simple pluckings from the lute of a traveling minstrel now and again. Worst of all, the people had forgotten why their kingdom was once great. The king of this land did not look as you might expect a king to look, for he did not have a magnificent throne or flowing robes or a golden crown inlaid with precious gems. He was the king of a poor kingdom, so he looked quite ordinary and poor himself. His castle was always cold and in need of repair. He had but one manservant and one milkmaid. He did not entertain the kings of other lands, for he was greatly ashamed of his kingdom. To the east of this unhappy land was a beautiful kingdom with great farms and glorious cathedrals and castles. There were lovely gardens adorned with fine sculptures and sparkling fountains. Night and day the breeze from the city walls carried the most exquisite music and the enticing scents of perfume, myrrh, cassia, and cypress, as well as the smells of delicacies, for there was an abundance of food in the land. It made the people even more unhappy to look on the wealth of their neighbors, for despite their poverty, the people prided themselves on having once been a great kingdom. The king did not often leave his castle, for he was weary of the complaints of his subjects. One day, as he sat down to a meagre dinner of bread, a slab of cheese, and boiled mutton, there was a knock at the castle door. The king's servant opened the door to find an old man with a large oak walking stick. The man wore a cap and a girdle and a coarse woolen tunic. A large cloak of skin was draped around his shoulders. He was carrying a leather canister which hung from his shoulders by rawhide. "Hail," said the old man. "I am but passing through your kingdom to the village to the east. I am looking for an inn to spend the night." The servant frowned. "This is not an inn. This is the king's castle." The traveler looked around in surprise. "This is not much of a castle," he said. "Aye," the servant agreed. "Still, I am weary from my journey. I would like to rest here." "You must inquire of my lord," the servant said. "Lead me to him," said the old man. The servant led the old man down a dark, cold hallway to the king's dining room. The king looked up from his meal as the man entered. "You are the king of this land?" the old man asked. "I am," the king replied. "You do not look like a king." The king frowned. "I am the king of a poor kingdom. Our farms do not grow, our buildings are falling down, and my people weary me day and night with their complaints. We were once a great kingdom, but all that has changed." The man nodded slowly. "Why do you not change back?" he asked. "Change?" the king replied angrily. "We have tried, only to fail. We lack all knowledge of what once made us the great kingdom." "You lack but one thing," the old man said. "If you agree to give me supper and lodging for the night, I will, on the morrow, show you why you fail." The king looked at him thoughtfully and then said, motioning to the platters of bread, of cheese and meat, "Eat your fill." The servant brought in a wooden platter, and the old man ate with the king. When the old man was finished with his meal, the servant led him to his room. That night, as the king lay in his bed, he wondered if the stranger had tricked him. The next morning the old man came to the king in his throne room. "You have lived up to your part of the bargain. Now I will live up to mine. Follow me." The king followed the old man to the castle balcony. There the old man brought out a long, round canister and pulled from it a brass tube with a sewn leather cover. A spyglass. He raised the spyglass to his eye and looked out over the land until a smile crossed his face. Then he handed the spyglass to the king. "Look thither," he said. The king looked out through the glass. He could see great farms and gardens, magnificent castles and cathedrals. He lowered the spyglass and said impatiently, "I have seen the wonders of the Eastern Kingdom. I hear far too much of them." "You are mistaken," said the old man. "It is your kingdom that you see." The king again raised the spyglass. This time he recognized the hills and glens of his own kingdom. But where there had been barren pasture, there were now fields of grain stretching as far as the eye could see. His own people were in the fields. Their wagons were overflowing with their harvest. "You're a wizard," said the king. "It's just a trick of the glass." "It is no trick," said the old man. But when the king put the glass down, his kingdom looked the same as it did before. "Nothing has changed," said the king. "No," said the old man. "Change requires work. But one must first see before doing." The king again raised the glass. "Ah, what greatness this kingdom holds!" "You have seen what might be," said the old man. "Now go and make it so. After 2 harvests, I will return for my spyglass." The king, on horseback, went out into his kingdom. He rode until he came to the edge of the once beautiful garden, now overrun with weeds and thistles. No one walked in the garden. There was neither the cry of happy, playing children, nor the pleased sighs of lovers. A group of villagers were standing outside of its fence. Their children played at their feet in the dirty roadway. "Why do you not use the garden?" the king asked them. "It is not fit, sire," replied a woman. "So it is not," agreed the king. "But could it be? Look." The king held out the spyglass. One by one the villagers looked through the tube at the garden. The weeds and thistles were gone, and the lawns were lush and inviting. But when they set down the glass, the garden had returned to its overgrown state. "It's an amusing device," said one man, "but of no use." "No use indeed," the king said. "Behold, knave." And he went to the garden and began to pull the weeds up by his own hand. When the villagers saw what he was doing, they too began to pull up weeds, until they had uncovered a large marble statue of an angel, its wings spread and its face looking towards heaven. The people stared at the statue in silent awe. At length the king mounted his horse. Before he left, he said, "You have seen what might be. Now go and make it so." The king rode farther down the road until he came to a farmer sitting on the ground threshing grain with a small flail. "How goes it, man?" the king asked. The weary farmer could barely look up. "Can't even grow enough food to feed ourselves, sire," the farmer said sadly. The king lifted the spyglass from his coat. "Come hither, good man. Behold your farm." The farmer lifted the eyeglass to his eye and gasped, "This is sorcery." "Ah, but you have seen what might be," said the king. "Now go and make it so." Farther down the road the king came to a crumbling cathedral. The roof had rotted and fallen in, and it was no longer safe to enter its arched doors. There were tents pitched outside, where a small congregation had gathered. The king rode his horse up to a tent. The friar, who stood before his people, stopped speaking at his approach. All turned to see the king. "Why do you meet in tents?" the king asked. "Why, sire, our cathedral has fallen." "Well, why have you not rebuilt it?" The friar opened his arms to his congregation. "We are few in number and poor." "Well, have you shown your congregation what could be?" the king asked. The friar looked quizzically at the king. "And what might that be?" "See for yourself," said the king, handing him the spyglass. The friar looked through it and saw a new cathedral, larger than the decaying building and more elaborate, adorned with beautiful sculptures of saints and cherubs. The friar stared in awe. "By the grace of God," he said, "I have seen a vision." "You have seen what might be," said the king. "Now go and make it so." Day by day the king went out until he had visited all of the people of his kingdom and shown them what might be. Though there were those who would not look through the glass or who refused to believe what they saw, the greater part of the villagers, though, looked with wonder and hope. That same year there was a plentiful harvest, and the farmers filled their wagons and barns with grain. But not just the farmers prospered. The wagon builders were busy building wagons to carry all the grain, and the millers were busy milling the grain into flour. For the first time for as long as the villagers could remember, there was more than enough to eat. Music and dancing again filled the streets. Old buildings were repaired and new buildings arose, including the buildings of the most majestic cathedral in all the land. As promised, 2 harvests later, the old man returned to the kingdom. He almost did not recognize the castle, for so greatly had it changed. The scarred wooden door he had once knocked on was new and intricately carved. Beautiful tapestries adorned the now new polished marble floors, and the castle's once cold chambers were warmed with heat and music, and the king was attended to by a bevy of servants and maids. The king, dressed in lavish robes and furs of silk, warmly welcomed the old man. "My friend," he said, "I have awaited your return. Look what prosperity your spyglass has brought my people. Let us make merry and prepare a great feast in your honor." The old man smiled. "You have done well," he said, "but I cannot tarry. I have only come for my spyglass, and then I will be on my way." At this the king frowned. "In the 2 seasons since you've blessed us with your arrival, we have accumulated much treasure. In exchange for the spyglass, I will trade all of the gold in the royal coffers, with men and wagons enough to carry it to wherever your destination." "You have spoken wisely," said the old man, "for the gift of the spyglass is worth more than all the gold in all the royal coffers all throughout the land. But keep your gold. You no longer need the spyglass." "But there is still much to be done," pleaded the king. "Yes," said the old man, "but you no longer need the spyglass. You can see without it." "How is that possible?" asked the king. The old man replied, "The spyglass only showed you what could be if you believed, for it was only faith that you and your people lacked." The king just shook his head in disbelief. "How can this be? Faith is foolishness." "So says the fool," the old man said. "Faith is the beginning of all journeys. It is by faith that the seed is planted. It is by faith that the foundation is dug. It is by faith that each book is penned and each song is written. Only with faith can we see that which is not, but can be. The eye of faith is greater than the natural eye, for the natural eye sees only a portion of truth. The eye of faith sees without bounds or limits." "I had not supposed," the king said. "That is why you once failed," said the old man. "Faith is why you now succeed." He placed his hand on the king's shoulder and with a smile said, "You have seen what might be. Now go and make it so." And though the old man and his spyglass were never again seen in the land, the kingdom continued to prosper and became again the great kingdom of old. Yet, despite their abundance of food, their beautiful buildings, their lush gardens, and majestic cathedrals, it was ever after said of that kingdom that their greatest treasure was their faith.